Hey guys, I'm Nick from Nasty Nick's Motorsports. I'm going to show you how to replace crank seals on this Kawasaki 650 engine. Now this is going to be the same process for the 440, 550, 750, 800, 900, 1100. Pretty much all the Kawasaki engines are going to have more or less the same process, and a lot of the Yamaha 650 701s as well. So the first thing we're going to have to do here is we need to remove this rear coupler back here so that we can access the crank seals in this motor. So you can use a special tool. This is one we made ourselves. It works pretty good, but a good old-fashioned plumber's wrench actually works pretty damn good. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and block the engine so that the engine can't turn over while we're trying to take off this coupler. Now, there's a lot of fancy tools out there, but I can tell you from pretty much any mechanic is using the same thing as me, which is either a piece of rope or a soft piece of hose. So we're going to go ahead and shove this in there. Make sure the piston's just about all the way at the top. That way you don't have to put too much rope in there, and just go ahead and keep feeding that until it pretty much stops. And we're looking for that to go ahead and stop about right there should be good. We'll rotate it. You can see it's locked up nice and tight. And now what we're going to do is go ahead and remove this rear coupler right here. So we can read 10 millimeter on a gun. Not much effort there. That one spun a stud out. No big deal. You can put that back in when you reinstall. And you can see that the coupler on this particular engine has been damaged. So that's the downside of using a plumber's wrench, is it does tend to put teeth marks in it, but it gives you just maximum leverage, especially one this big. So we're going to go ahead and lay that on there right now and see if we can spin that coupler off. All right, we're going to have to put this on the floor. Give me a second. And there it goes. Easy enough. Looks like I kind of bent that stud there, but I'll go ahead and replace that. We got a bunch of those around here. Now on your own engine, if you do get stuck on that one part, I highly suggest heating up this back part with a torch, but don't heat it too much because you can melt the crank seals on behind that. All right, now that rear coupler is off, we're gonna go ahead and take off the flywheel cover up here in the front. Again, 10 millimeter at a gun. Make sure not to lose the O-ring on the back side of the engine's front cover. Give me a second here, grab a pin hammer. Now sometimes there will be water in there. If you guys have a table with a drain like this one, I highly suggest getting one of those, because a lot of times when you open this front cover, it's going to completely fill with oil. This one isn't too bad. You can see residue down here. That's got a good amount of oil kind of built up around here. This isn't too bad, but before we sell any engine in our shop, we always replace the crank seals just to make double sure that it's a good engine. So at this point now, we're going to remove the flywheel in the next part. All right, guys. So what we have now is we're going to take the front bolt off the flywheel, and then we're going to go ahead and carefully install one of these. This is a harmonic balancer puller from a car. This works excellent on getting off the Yamaha 650 701s and the Kawasaki 650 and 550 440 flywheels as well. Pretty much anything that you have to put a bolt into and kind of do that triple clamp to pull it off. Now, I do use a max set for a reason. For whatever reason, the max set reverberates just right, and I've never had a flywheel get stuck on the crank. That's including ones I bought from customers that, well, they just don't come off. Well, for us, they do. So for whatever reason, this one seems to work really good. The Harbor Freight one sometimes works, Snap-on sometimes, but the Mac one always works. And it's also pretty inexpensive too, usually on eBay used. So. All right, guys. So when you set up the puller, I usually use the smallest piece and then the smallest nipple at the end of this. You don't want to mushroom the inside of those holes in there. And then when you grab the bolts, you have to thread these in by hand. Do not make the mistake of putting these in with an impact, a wrench, or anything else. You just put them in your fingers and you just put them in a couple threads. Now the reason is the stator is directly behind that. There is nothing to stop these bolts from going right into the stator. And I can guarantee you that about half the people that buy a stator off us are buying them because they messed up this one thing while they did crank seals. It's really common. Don't make that mistake. Do not run these in with the gun. Just take your time, put them in a couple threads, and then you want to gently drag back this triangle piece and then check it with kind of by eye to make sure that it's nice and flush and you have them in there at about the same measurement. So at this point now, we're going to go ahead and take a 17 millimeter and we're going to run it in with the impact and put a little pressure on it. Oh, not 17. Sorry, it's 19. It's not in order. All right, here we go. Now snug it up, make sure everything looks good. It's all nice and lined up. Now go ahead and give it some torque, and it pops right off. So again, kind of going back to which puller we use and why, that's why. You can actually see, unfortunately, looks like the stator got a little burned up by somebody. It wasn't us. We didn't have to do any heating here at all. Stator's in good shape. The bendix just comes out easily. Just grab that, pull that right out. Put the flywheel aside there. Make sure that the Woodruff key in your setup is still good. Ours is right there. It's still in pretty good shape. Now the next part, we're going to go ahead and remove the stator, and I'll show you how I do that. All right, guys, for the next part, I do highly suggest using an impact just because it makes this job a million times easier. If you try to pull out these Phillips screws with a hand tool, it almost always rounds and you end up having to get out the air hammer. It's a huge pain. So to take out the ones that are over here running the wires through, you're going to use a number 2, and we have a number 2 bit that's a little bit longer. Kind of snap it in there, put it in, apply a little bit of pressure, and that spins out no problem. Now, that's the one when you do by a hand tool does not just want to seem to come out. You know, there's also a lot of corrosion down here, so make sure you might have to soak some of these. So go ahead and put pressure, spins out no problem. You're going to switch to number 3 bit for the stator itself. Go ahead and do that same thing, put a little bit of pressure, spins out, and a little bit of pressure, spins right up. So once that's out, you can go ahead and just pull forward. Stator comes right to the motor, no problem. And for us, we're going to shell this as a short block, so there's no need to keep the stator back on the motor. But if you go to put it back on, all you really have to do is line up that mark right there with the mark on the on the stock stator, which is going to be, let's see, where is it? So it took us a second to find that. We had to wipe it off. The stock mark right there, that little cut mark, lines up to the cut mark on the motor. And if you want to advance it, by the way, our other video explains this a little better, but you just rotate that counterclockwise. And once you counterclockwise that, it'll give it a little bit of an advance, or you can go to the right to retard it. So we're going to go ahead and put the stator over here. Now, a lot of people, a lot of mechanics, a lot of bad mechanics will tell you when you have to do crank seals, you have to take the top end off. That's not true at all, actually. So on these motors, just like all the other ones, we can spin this upside down, access the crank from the backside, and we can lift it up just enough to be able to slide the seals in and out. That way we don't have to take any of this apart. And as most of you guys already know, taking a top end off a Kawasaki old jet ski, it can be a pain. There's likelihood that most of these 650s will never separate, and the ones that do, it kind of ruins the case coming out. So this saves you a lot of time and effort, so we're gonna go ahead and do that now. So in the last part, what I did there is I went ahead and spun out that fitting, that way the motor can lay flat. If you still have the carburetor and the exhaust manifold attached on your own motor, it's not going to affect that. You can still turn it upside down. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and pull this bed plate off. Be very careful not to lose these 4 bolts because they look identical to the ones that go into the motor mounts on this side over here. The difference is coarse thread versus fine thread. So just make sure to keep these 4 with the motor mount plate, so that way you don't, cross thread one or the other. Alright, so now that plate just comes right off. Set that down. Now we're looking at the back side of the motor here. Now these are secured down with 12s and 10 millimeters. So what you're going to do is you're going to come through here and you're just going to go ahead and take all those out real easy, nice and easy with the gun. So we're going to go ahead and do another time lapse on that. Alright guys, now all these bolts are off. All you have to do is go into the pry point. So there's one right here, the number 12. Stick a screwdriver in there and just kind of gently work it around there. Go around to the other side, do the same thing. If it fights you a little bit, you might need to get a bigger screwdriver than me, which I'll find my pry bar in a second here. Good old trusty red screwdriver, which is too big for that hole. All right, let's try a different one. There we go. So it's not really held in with much. It's just kind of a mild glue that the factory uses. And just be sure that if you're working a screwdriver around these mating surfaces, you go extremely gentle. You don't want to mar up any aluminum as you're doing this. So you can see I actually got that corner just by pushing down in the light one. So once this is off, you go ahead and inspect the bottom of the case for any kind of cracks or anything. This one looks pretty good aside from being really dirty. And we take a better look at the crank. Now this crank, you can see, aside from being used, looks in pretty good shape. We don't see any kind of corrosion. The rods seem like they've seen a little bit of heat. Overall, this should work pretty fine. And then we'll go in here and we'll go ahead and test the bearings and make sure it looks good. It looks like there might be a little bit of moisture right here, but nothing major. More or less normal for an engine that sees use. So at this point now, what we're going to do is We're going to come in here with an impact and a brass brush, and we're going to clean up the outside mating edges the best we can and make sure not to hit the bearings and everything too much. Now you want to make sure that the debris doesn't fall into the motor. So you want to use the setting on the gun, which is to turn it from your point of view clockwise. That way it spins the material outward, not inward. So at that point, that'll be the time lapse in a minute. So what you can use is either a brass brush on an impact, or you can use a good Scotch-Brite pad by hand, basically, or like a hard sponge or any kind of really abrasive anything, really, to take that off. Don't use sandpaper unless it's super fine grit, because it does not take much to take this off. So I'm gonna go ahead and start here, and you can see what I'm doing. So you just kind of come around here, and we're just gonna go ahead and take all this black stuff off. And my gun's about to die here. Hold on. That's better. Now you don't need to push very hard. You just go around. This makes this job a lot easier. It saves you about an hour of work. And it can be done in about 15 seconds. You can get one of these on Amazon for like $6. So I highly suggest it. It's also not very abrasive, so you can run into things and it doesn't really do too much to it. You can see it actually doesn't make it any less smooth. It just took off all that kind of RTV or silicone or Yamaha bond or whatever was there the last time somebody did this. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do the other side. Now the other side, you just get as best as you can. Come in there with a hand tool if you need to, like a handheld brush if you need to clean up the edges. But for the most part, you should be able to get 90% of it. So go ahead and do the top now. And again, you're just kind of working yourself around. If there's any residual material left over in this process, it's not usually a big deal, because it does have a tendency to bond. What we use is 1211 by 3 bond. It's a pretty benign substance. It can go in the motor. It can do pretty much anything. It just kind of turns to a powder and comes out. I mean, obviously don't go too wild with it, because if there's too much in there, it can cause a problem. But for the most part, you know, if it can bond to just about anything in here. So if we don't get all the material, it's not a big deal. So we're going to go ahead and take out this other side. Okay, so now the next part, we're going to go ahead and take a nice, decently clean rag, and we're going to shoot it down with a little bit of brake cleaner and come in here and clean up the edges. And we'll check in with you after that. All right, guys, so now that the surfaces are all cleaned up, what I like to do here is I like to mark the center bearing exactly where the pin is. Now, there is a pin on 90% of the engines where it's down there straight into this bearing, and it can be kind of hard to line this back up. Now, you can see on this particular one, it does not have the pin. This is an older 650 engine. They didn't come with that. You can actually see that the pinhole is actually rotated up here. That's pretty normal when it doesn't have a pin. Now, for those of you that do have the pin, which is most of you who are watching this, and ones on a Yamaha, I find it easy to come in here. I draw a nice line right here, and I kind of draw a couple marks here to show where that bearing needs to be to line up to a pin. Now, again, this one doesn't have a pin, and it's not necessary to do this, but I'm doing this for the context of the video so that those of you that are working on 750, 800s, or most 650s that do have that pin now know how to line it up. Now, it just comes in to be a little bit handy as we lift up the crank now and we replace the seals and know exactly where that thing needs to go back in. Now, the first seal just came out pretty easy, but all you got to do is just take a rubber mallet, kind of give it a tap on both sides, and the crank usually comes free. Once it comes free, I like to lift it up and rotate it, and that way I have full access to the seals, and you just pull the seals off. Doesn't take much. Grab them with your hands, throw them on in there. And then what I do now is you come in here and you just clean up these mating surfaces where the seals go in. Now, you want to kind of get a lot of that oil out of there. Sometimes there's crustiness or corrosion. This particular one looks pretty good. And then also inspect the areas that mounts to the front of the crank to see if there's any unusual damage. So overall, this motor is looking pretty decent, especially for one that's some 30-something years old. So we're going to go ahead and keep going forward. All right, guys, at this point, we're going to go ahead and install the new crank seals. And we have a tube of grease here and some seals. Now, the Cometic and the WSM are pretty good, and we'll put a link in our description there if you want to check out our eBay store and buy them from us. But more or less, just make sure that they're new, good seals. And like anything else, every mechanic in the world is going to have their own opinion on how to do all this stuff. We're showing it the way we do it. We do about 100 of these engines a year. We sell thousands of crank seals, and more or less, you know, what we tend to do seems to work out. Now, as far as what brand grease to use, we use marine grease, but more or less just go with the cheapest grease you can find. A lot of the new additives in the new grease doesn't exactly work with some of the older components, because remember, these motors were designed in the 80s. They weren't exactly designed for a lot of the stuff we have today. So now, as far as orientation, you're going to have two different kinds of seals with you. You have two that look the same and one that's not. Now, you're going to group the one of this type and the one of this type, and that's going to be your rear set. And the way that's going to go in there is it's going to be the open side of that seal facing out towards the PTO, with that side with the spring out facing out towards the PTO as well. Now, what you're going to do is when you go ahead and install these, you have to fill the innermost side of this seal up with grease completely flat. Now, it's going to stop some air leak. And on all the seals, you want to go ahead and fill the inside here, the double lips that contacts the crank. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to go ahead and fill this. Now, I'm going to be a little bit more liberal here with the grease. You want to make sure you get as much of that in there as you can, and then literally fill that entire inside area. It's going to get messy. If you have gloves, go for it. If not, just go ahead and do what I'm doing. So in any case, we're going to go in here. We're going to go ahead and layer that in there real nice. Make sure you pack it in as best you can. All right, so what I'm doing now is I'm packing the inside of the seal in nice and tight. And you want to make sure you put as much grease in there as you possibly can. Go ahead and try to not keep as much of that off the outside edge as you can. And that's going to be about perfect. Now, there's a little bit too much there in that inside. Let me pull it out. So a lot of people will tell you you don't need to put grease there. That's true. If you plan on selling this jet ski tomorrow, go ahead and not put grease there because it will leak. That is something that's going to happen. It might not happen today or tomorrow, but without grease there, it tends to run dry, and then it tends to just kind of leak air. Now, by the way, if you ever do have an air leak, what happens is the motor runs away uncontrollably, even if you're not touching the vehicle. To shut that off, just kind of word to wise here, pull the throttle and hit the red button at the exact same time. It seems counterproductive to pull the throttle, but it will shut the jet ski off immediately. It'll kind of arc up for a quarter second, then it'll shut off. A lot of people that have a runaway idle, which is what that's called, have no idea how to shut it off, and they end up just letting the ski run itself to death until it melts or something. In any case, that's kind of just a little bit of a factoid there as we're going through crank seals, because 9 times out of 10, that's where it's coming from. It's leaking from the crank seals. So when you go to install it, the other seal here, this is just going to be the hollow side with a little bit of grease on the front here. And then we're just going to put this in the front of the crank. So you're going to nicely massage it over, give the crank a lift, and just kind of gently put that into position. It's going to slide all the way back until it contacts, and then you can just kind of lower it down, and it'll kind of find its home right there. You want to make sure it connects about right there into the crank in the right location. So we're going to do the same thing for the back side now. We're going to lift it up. All right, so we're going to go put the back one on there. So go ahead and lift it up again, and just gently move that over the top of the crank into position. So then you lower it down. You want to watch that pin location. Again, mine doesn't have a pin, so it doesn't matter that it rotated, but it is firmly seated all the way around. And we'll go ahead and check and make sure that it's seated in all the areas. All right, guys, now that the seals are nicely seated on here and we got plenty of grease in there, we go ahead and we just kind of wipe down the surfaces, make sure everything's as clean as possible. And then what we're going to use here is 3-Bond 1211. Now, this is a tube. You can see it obviously gets used at our shop all the time. This is readily available on Amazon, eBay, pretty much anywhere. It's about 20 bucks a tube, a little pricey, but it works excellent. And you'll be able to use this for pretty much anything. Intake gaskets, exhaust gaskets, as long as the holes aren't plugged on the gaskets. This is what a lot of people use to seal up areas. And it works excellent for the crankcase, and it's what Kawasaki recommends. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and spread this on both surfaces. And you're not looking to just cake it on there. You kind of need to see the metal through the amount of sealant you're doing. I tend to go a little bit heavy, and then I kind of clean it up as it smushes out on either side. But so we're going to go ahead and do that now in a time lapse. All right, guys, so I always kind of go towards more than less. And what I do is I'm going to kind of gently set it down. It's going to smush out in both areas over here. And what we're going to do is once everything's nice and set, we're going to come up here, kind of clean it up, and then rotate the crank and wipe it off the crank lobes. Overall, it's a pretty easy setup from here on. We're just going to give it about 8 to 10 minutes to get tacky, and then we're going to set the crankcase on there and tighten it down. So we'll go ahead and give it about 10 minutes, and we'll come back. All right, guys, so while I'm waiting for this to get tacky, I'm going to go ahead and install a block-off plate. Now, you can get these just about anywhere. There's no difference in brand whatsoever. They all come with the same idea, which is basically just 2 areas with O-rings that plug up the stock drain on the crankcase. Now, if your stock drain is still in place for some reason, not many of them are still left on there, by the way. If it is, it's actually pretty useful. If you sink your ski and something goes wrong, it allows you to basically plunge the inside of the motor. It opens up 2 plungers and it dumps out everything inside of it, and you're able to, go back to riding. But the downside is, as years has gone on, those holes pretty much start to leak the stock plunger. So what we do now is we just go ahead and take a block off plate and we just block it off entirely. So what you're going to want to do is you can install it the way they come in the package, but I highly suggest you take a little bit of that 1211 from the previous part of this video and you just kind of rub it around the O-ring. You can get a little sloppy here. It's not going to impact anything if it smushes out around the area or on the inside, because there's just nothing there. It's just basically a tunnel. So go ahead and throw those in there. Throw a good amount of 1211 on it. See if you can get both sides. I kind of stuck that one in there a little bit prematurely. Stick that one in there again. Nice little good little layer. I'm probably gonna give a little bit more to that one. I always go more than less here because if this does leak, this will cause a catastrophic failure in your engine. So if you have something, you know, I highly suggest putting 1211 or some kind of sealant on these O-rings. It just helps them seat a lot better, and that way if the rubber from the O-rings goes bad, then it's more or less the sealant itself holding it, and that'll hold on for eternity. So this is pretty easy. This is gonna go ahead and go on there like that, and I'm gonna go ahead and tighten up those bolts. Just give me 1 second. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tighten those a little bit with the gun and then finish it out tightening it by hand. You don't wanna go too tight, you just wanna go tight enough to where, go ahead and stop, go like there, good, and good. So now that's nice and done, and this has gotten tacky. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go ahead and set the crankcase gently together and then tap it downward. Line it up, give it a pop, and we're on. So now what we're going to go ahead and do now is we're going to install the bolts in order. Now it's very hard to make out because this one's a little bit dirty, but they are numbered. That one's number 5, 1, 4, and so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and hand tighten these in all the way around, make sure they catch threads, and then we're going to run them in gently with an impact, and then we're going to go ahead and finish it off with the torque wrench. All right, so we're just going to take the gun, we're just going to go ahead and snug these up. Don't want to go too snug. We're going to do the final torque with the torque wrench. This just kind of saves a little bit of time as I move through this. Make sure you go in order and follow the numbers. I'm not even letting this thing torque. I'm just kind of barely running these things in. Now, it's not so important about the 10 millimeters that run around the edges as much as it is to make sure that these 8 are the perfect torque. And we're going to go ahead and tighten these, and then we're going to do the 10s. So the torque on this one is wrench here, we got it set to 22. We're going to go ahead and run it around. Now this, you don't need to spend a lot of money, just make sure you have a torque wrench of some kind. This one's some kind of really old knockoff one I've had for a while, but it does seem to get the right torque. So kind of go gentle, get it nice and torqued, and we're going to go ahead and run around and do all these to 22. Now you can step it up if you want, start at like a 10, go to a 15, then go to 22, but I've never had any problems just going straight to 22 and just kind of gently snugging it up. Occasionally, if you're working with something that has heavy corrosion, I suggest, you know, stepping up, which is the Yamaha way, which is you start at a lower torque and then step up to it. So we're going to go ahead and tighten this down, and we'll catch you at the end of the video. All right, so now that all those 8 are torqued, we're going to do the same thing over here on the 10. So just kind of gently run those things in, and that one threads a little bit buttered up on that one. Moving through. Now you can notice I'm being far less careful with these 10s. And the reason is the 10s aren't exactly holding the crankcase together, they're just kind of giving it support, as opposed to the 12 millimeters over here. So with that said, when we do the 10s, I highly suggest just tighten those by hand. If you try to go to the proper torque like the book says, you're almost for sure going to snap them off, and we always do as well. So what we do is instead we just kind of move around with a ratchet and we tighten them up, doing the final torque in order by hand, and then we've been doing that for years, and well, it's worked out pretty good. So we're gonna go ahead and do that now. Final step we're gonna do here, as you can see, it looks kind of messy. We're gonna come in here with some paper towels, and we're gently gonna clean up these edges, clean up the back side of this plate, take out the extra grease, just kind of generally kind of clean it up. Now, if you are super lazy and you don't feel like doing any of that, nothing's gonna happen. It'll run perfectly fine just the way it is, but you know, for cosmetic purposes, we'll come by and do a little smoothing out. So overall, we're pretty much done here at this point. We're just gonna clean it up, and I'll show you the finished product. Over, everything's clean, and we had a little bit of extra sealant get on the crank lobe, so we wiped it off. If you get some on there, just go ahead and take a paper towel and wipe it clean. If you leave it on there, well, it's not that big of a deal. So in any case, just go ahead and work in the reverse and put the bed plate back on and anything else you took off the motor. For us, this motor is going to get sold just like this. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, go ahead and throw them down there in the video. If you'd like to support us, check us out at Nasty Nick's Motorsports on eBay. And we also sell crank seals and used engines just like this. So if you guys need anything or want anything, give us an email. We just might have it. Thanks.